Content warning. This episode contains discussion of trauma, scrupulosity, self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and mental health struggles. We share this story as one of hope and recovery. If you are struggling, please reach out for help. In the U.S., dial or text 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. For international listeners, please seek resources in your area. Hello, and welcome to the Brenton Peck Podcast, where we delve into people's stories and the values that shaped them. Today, my first guest is Debra Peck, author of the Hijacked Conscience, a Book Life Best of 2024 selection. For nearly 40 years, she lived with undiagnosed religious scrupulosity OCD, a form of obsessive-compulsive disorder that blurs the line between faith and fear. This story is about what happens when your conscience turns against you and the freedom she found without losing her faith. Debra also happens to be my mom. Mom, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So for those who don't know, what is scrupulosity?
Well, religious scrupulosity, OCD, is a type of OCD that deals with the fear of sinning or the fear of not being spiritual enough or not doing your religious duties well enough. It's like any OCD, it's concerned with being certain. It's concerned with certainty. So like what hand washing OCD would be for a person who has a germ phobia, where they wash their hands to try and be certain that they have no germs. For a person with scrupulosity, they are concerned that for them, germs would be like sin. And so they want to be sure they've confessed enough or they don't have any sin in their lives. And it's an anxiety disorder like all forms of OCD.
Kind of like their version of just washing their hands, but more scrubbing their soul?
Yes, scrubbing their soul and doing compulsions. So the obsession would be sin. The compulsion would be things like reading scripture or quoting songs or specific things to help them deal with the anxiety that comes from the obsession.
I have watched a lot of different TV shows. Criminal Minds is one of them. There was an episode with scrupulosity on it, actually. And the person suffering with it had to do things in threes because it was tied to the Trinity. So to be holy, everything had to be tied in threes. And even more than that, 3 sets of threes. It seemed to compound and affect every part of her life. How did this affect your life? Like, let's start all the way back at childhood. Did you know you had scrupulosity as a kid?
I didn't know I had scrupulosity until actually about 10 years ago. But I started developing scrupulosity when I was about 11 or 12 years old. I had been raised in a very strict conservative holiness church that stressed following rules. And as a young child, I had given my heart to Jesus and loved Jesus and wanted to serve Jesus. But my family and that particular church kept telling me I wasn't doing it right. I wasn't being holy enough. And over the years as a child, I was able to deal with that. But then when I was about 11 or 12, I decided I was going to prove to God that I really was serious because I kept being told I was going to hell. So in this other church, the women didn't wear pants. They didn't cut their hair. They didn't wear jewelry, that kind of stuff. They didn't watch TV. And those that did, in their opinion, were going to hell. So when I was 5 and my mom and a couple of us kids left that church, our relatives would tell us that we were going to hell. They would tell me, Debbie, you're going to hell because you're wearing pants and you're cutting your hair. And it was really confusing to me because I knew I loved Jesus. I knew I'd given my heart to Jesus and wanted to serve God, but they made it seem as if I wasn't. And so at 11 or 12, I started doing things like I would pray very specific ways, the same way every time.
Like the Lord's Prayer?
Like the Lord's Prayer, or the sinner's prayer was a lot. On one I prayed a lot. before doing anything, because I became very afraid that I was going to die and go to hell if I didn't confess my sins. And so I started confessing my sins all the time. And even things I hadn't done, I became afraid that maybe I had done something. And so I would confess to attitudes or things I hadn't even done, just to be sure I had confessed everything and wasn't going to be surprised and go to hell. And so I started reading my Bible in certain ways. And as I started doing that, that's when I started having issues, like reading the Bible, for instance. So I would be reading along, let's say I had decided that I needed to read the Bible all the way through, because that's what we do. We read the Bible all the way through. And so here I am over reading the book of Numbers. And if anybody's ever read that, it's a delightful book with 500 zillion names that you can't pronounce. And so I'm reading along and I'm like, oh no, I think I forgot a word. I think I missed a word. So I would go back and reread the verse again, making sure I read every word. Oh no, what if I missed it again? And so I would read and reread and reread the same verses or the same passages. And then the thought would start to occur to me, well, why am I skipping passages? Is Satan deceiving me? Which is one of the things that the church would tell you, is Satan's trying to deceive you. Or am I just really not wanting to be a Christian? Am I not wanting to read something and obey God? And so I would just make sure I reread the same thing. Well, when you read the Bible like that, it becomes very burdensome.
Mm-hmm.
And so in those early years as a child, it affected me mostly in my reading, in praying, and in repeating the sinner's prayer all the time before I did anything. And I started to become very fearful of death. Like I remember as a child, I couldn't cross a bridge by myself. Now, if I was in a car with somebody or with somebody, I could cross a bridge, but I could not cross a bridge by myself. I was terrified that I would lose self-control and jump in. And I mean, it seems irrational now, but that was a very real fear that I lived with. Excuse me. Go
In
ahead.
your book, you talked a little bit about it's not like that you're afraid of falling, but
Right.
you're afraid that you might lose control and jump off because, and I'm skipping ahead and around in the
hmm
book, but you mentioned that if something crosses your mind, then that's truth. It's not just
Yes.
a random floating thought.
Right.
So it's like if a person's driving, they might have a random thought, what would happen if I swerved and hit the edge of a bridge? In
hmm
your mind as a kid, that same thing, if you have a passing thought, that's really deep. What if I
Yeah.
jumped off? To you, that meant then I intend to jump off, which probably meant you were intending to cause yourself harm,
hmm
and then that's a
Therefore, I'm an
sin.
evil person because I had this thought. Yeah, we can talk about the thought thing later, because that's a really important part of religious scrupulosity. It's called thought action fusion. So for most people, if they have a random thought go through their head, they can dismiss it. Like I use the example in my book about, so many years ago, there was this awful story about this woman who drowned her children. And so the next time when I was giving my child a bath, the thought crossed my mind, I could drown my child. Well, most people can just dismiss that as, oh, I saw that on TV, I'm not ever going to do that. But for a person with scrupulosity, they think, I had this thought, I must want to do it, therefore I'm a bad person. And they become very fearful that they're going to do it. So back to the bridge. Yeah, it wasn't a fear of falling. It was a fear that I would purposefully jump, that I
Even
would,
though you had no
even though I had
intention.
no intention of it, I just thought, well, I must want to jump, and so I can't cross the bridge. I became afraid of plugging stuff into the wall. I couldn't plug stuff into an outlet because I was afraid I would get shocked and die. And if I wasn't sure I had confessed my sins, then I would die and go to hell. I became fearful. So in the other church, um, one of the things that you don't do is you don't read anything secular on Sunday. Sunday's a holy day. You can't read anything secular. And I became so fearful that I would not look out the window on the way to church for fear I would read a McDonald's sign and get in a car accident and die and go to hell for having read the McDonald's sign. So I would just keep my head down the whole way to church so that I wouldn't accidentally sin and maybe go to hell. So it affected everything I did, every conversation I had. This is where I ended up with quite severe social anxiety. And a big part of that was this fear that I would lie or say something that wasn't true. So every conversation I had, afterward, I had to go home and replay the conversation in my head and see, did I exaggerate anywhere? Because that's lying. Did I outright lie anywhere? Did I hurt anybody's feelings? Is there anything I need to go back and apologize for? So I was always going back and apologizing for some little thing that nobody else had even noticed that I was afraid that I had done and sinned. And it's just, it totally took over my life.
There's an interesting tension there I want to tease out a little bit, because I know you actually attended two different churches. You started in the really conservative holiness one, and then you went to the Nazarene church. Different denominations interpret the Bible differently. So if you're dealing with religious scrupulosity, it sounds like not just a religious component tied to a singular viewpoint, but it sounds like there's a social component too of how people are interpreting it and conveying that to you. And with that dynamic of two churches, like, are you getting yanked back and forth between viewpoints? And as you're reviewing conversations in your head, it seems like then you're trying to analyze through multiple viewpoints, but they're conflicting. Like, how could you resolve those?
Well, theologically speaking, the Nazarene church and the other church that I attended as a young child believed the same things theologically. It was in the outward appearances that they didn't agree. And so, but I was yanked back and forth. So at times I would attend the other church and try and follow their rules. And then my family, especially my dad, would make fun of me, tell me I was brainwashed. But then by the same token, when I would not follow the rules and I would attend the Nazarene church, even my Nazarene friends would be telling me, you don't need to do what the other church says. And so no matter what I did, I was made fun of. And in my desire to just serve Jesus, I think I was ill served as a child by both churches. Although I've been a Nazarene now for a very long time and have a deep love for the Nazarene church. In my early years, and there was that tension between the two churches anyway, because many people that attended this other church had previously been Nazarene. So there was another dynamic going on there when I was a child. But to your point about how it's interpreted through different church lenses, scrupulosity it affects people in every single religion.
Not just Christian.
Not just Christian. It affects Muslim. It affects LDS. It affects Protestant. It affects Catholics. It affects people even who do not have a faith can be affected by religious scrupulosity.
So like atheists or agnostics?
Atheists, agnostics can every religion, and you quite often those without who are atheists will have a slightly different thing called moral scrupulosity, where they're concerned with rules and rule breaking. But there is a portion of atheists who, even though they don't believe in God, have religious scrupulosity, and in that scrupulosity fear God. It's kind of an interesting dynamic. But yeah, it's like OCD can affect anybody, anywhere. And it's the same with religious scrupulosity. It can just show up anywhere.
It sounds to me almost like religious scrupulosity. I'm seeing a hierarchy. Religious scrupulosity is almost a subset of moral scrupulosity, which is a subset of OCD, where they're kind of staggered. Overarching of the religious is a moral viewpoint, where the religious is a specific overlay of what those morals are, whether it's following the Christian morals or the Muslim morals or insert religion there. It seems like that's a subset of the moral, which is then
hmm
all ultimately under the overall OCD spectrum.
Right, right. And people ask me all the time, is there a genetic component? Well, we know that OCD runs in families. So just OCD has a genetic predisposition, so to speak. But not every, so just like any other disease or whatever that people are predisposed to, not everyone will get it. But quite often, if there's a trigger for a person who's already predisposed to OCD, excuse me, they will get OCD, they will get their scrupulosity.
It seems like that's the case with many mental illnesses. Like I know bipolar is one that's oftentimes triggered by a significant event, like the death of a loved one or a significant move or something. There always seems to be like you're predisposed and you might experience small amounts of it,
hmm
but there's some large life altering event that really kicks it into gear.
Right. And for me, I can point exactly to the life event. I was 9 years old and I had gone back. The church of my early childhood was having what they called a tent revival. So they erected this big tent and were having revival services. And I went one night to that. And as the pastor was preaching, I started thinking, well, I wonder if I really asked forgiveness of my sins. Wonder if I really asked God sufficiently to forgive my sins. So I decided to go to the altar, excuse me, which is what you do in that church denomination. You go up to the front and kneel at an altar and confess your sins. So I went up and started confessing my sins. And one of my aunts came up and started praying with me. Now, Debbie, tell God you'll quit wearing pants. Tell God you'll quit cutting your hair. Tell God you'll quit watching TV. Well, none of those was what I was there talking with God about. And I remember kneeling there being completely devastated, feeling I will never be holy enough. I will never be good enough. Whatever the enough is, I will never get there. And that moment changed the whole trajectory of my life because I became aware of this tug of war between the two churches and between the two ways of believing in God, and felt very pulled both directions. And so that started, even though I didn't develop the scrupulosity till a couple years later, that started me on that journey toward it.
Yeah.
And it has been a moment in my life that is as clear in my mind as something that happened yesterday.
It's interesting you can identify that trigger point so
hmm
clearly. Something occurred to me I haven't thought of before. Have you read Dante's Inferno?
I have not read it. No.
Do you, you've heard of it
Oh,
though?
yes, yes.
I haven't read it either, but I've heard enough of it in different podcasts or videos or other books that I've read. The seventh layer of Dante's Inferno, do you know what it is?
No.
Betrayal. So the lowest
Mm-hmm.
layer is Satan, and those that surround him are those who betray.
Mm-hmm.
And what comes to mind is it feels like scrupulosity is your own mind betraying yourself.
Yes.
But then also within that, because you're also feeling like every action you're doing is betraying God. Because
Mm-hmm.
I know in your book you mentioned you don't ever blame God. You view
No.
God as fully loving and
Mm-hmm.
he's choosing you, but you feel like you're the one that is so sinful he can't live in you.
Mm-hmm.
And so it comes to mind is that Dante's Inferno. You feel like you're living in that deepest layer of hell, of that your mind's betraying you. You feel like you're betraying God, even though that's not true. That's how you're feeling. And that image comes to mind, like living with that has to feel at some level like you're living through hell.
Yeah, it is. It is hell on earth. I I have heard it said as I was researching my book. I came across several that said religious scrupulosity is the most difficult mental illness to treat because it does deal with that deep relationship with God and the fear of eternal damnation. And so, yeah, betrayal of self, that's a great way to put it, a great way to express what that feels like, and the betrayal toward God. Because as you say, I never blamed God. And, a lot of people who go through abuse or who go through difficult, especially spiritual abuse, where they feel like God is standing over them with a club waiting to club them down if they do something wrong. That was never my experience. I didn't feel like God was waiting to club me down. I knew God loved me, or God was, I should say, I knew God was love, but I didn't think I was lovable. And I didn't think God even saw me as an individual, because I felt I was too sinful for God to look upon, because that was another false thing that I was taught through scripture, that God can't look on a person, on a sinner. And so, yeah, I didn't think God even noticed me. I was too sinful, too awful, and any punishment I got, I thought I deserved. And I share in my book a very, probably the darkest place that scrupulosity took me was in an area of self-harm, where I had heard a pastor preach about Paul beating his body into submission. And so I would literally take a belt and beat myself to try and show God how sorry I was for my sin, and how serious I took it, and not realizing Jesus had already taken all my punishment. I didn't have to punish myself anymore. But yeah, scrupulosity is a deep level of betrayal to oneself, where your
Yeah,
own mind and your own body betrays you over and over and over.
I can definitely see this. Um, Dante's Inferno, going to that seventh layer of hell, makes me want to reread through that, or I'd be curious your thoughts if you read through it and see if you identify the other layers of hell going up, because
Yeah.
it's typically portrayed. It's kind of like hell is an eternal dissension
Hmm.
and heaven is an eternal ascension. And so you kind of, everybody kind of starts baseline and they slowly descend into hell, or quickly, I mean, but they go through these different layers. So I'd
Hmm.
be curious, if you're at the depth of the seventh layer of hell feeling that constant betrayal, what other parts, again, not that you're actually in hell, but
Right.
what parts is your mind telling you that you're in hell on earth, and
Hmm.
your body and your experience? It was something I just never thought of that I
Yeah,
found
I'll have to go
interesting.
back and read Dante's Inferno, and maybe we can have a future talk about it.
Yeah. um I had another thought there, but it's kind of skipped my grasp. So let's continue on from your childhood story. I think we were
Hmm.
talking about age 11. How did things progress from there?
So from there, I started um, trying to live out the way that this other church, this conservative holiness church, said to live. And as I mentioned, my dad would make fun of me, and then if I was, and the Nazarene people would make fun of me, and then if I wasn't, then I was told I was going to hell. So um, I started descending down into depression. Of course, I had no name for it. I was a child. The church did not talk about depression. It wasn't a thing that anybody mentioned. But looking back on it, I descended over a number of years into a very, very deep depression. And I remember just living was like I was living down inside of this tunnel. And everything I did, every conversation I tried to listen to, everything I was engaging with in life was like way out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to work really hard to function on a day-to-day basis. And by the time I was 15 or so, the depression was really impacting my ability to function. And I also, along with that, developed a number of phobias. And I mentioned the bridges, but I became afraid to go anywhere by myself. I became afraid to be alone. That was twofold. One, I was like a natural fear that a lot of women especially have, is the fear of being attacked
Yeah.
if I'm on my own. But the other part of that that was maybe even bigger was I was afraid to be alone because I was afraid it would embolden me to sin, that there'd be nobody around to make sure I wasn't sinning. Even though I had no desire to sin and made no plans to do so, I was afraid to be alone because I just might lose my mind and go wild and sin, you know, um, which is slightly amusing to me now, but it was not amusing to me back
I
then.
bet not.
But I became afraid of riding in a car. If I had to ride in a car, I would say the sinner's prayer first, just to make sure I had confessed my sins and knew that God knew that I was sorry. And I just fearful of everything. It was terrible. And so at just before my 16th birthday, I decided I am going to, since I can't seem to find peace with God and I have all this stuff, because the church was telling me I was sinful. And so I thought that must be it. So I moved in with some of my relatives who were part of that church and thinking I will fully embrace the conservative holiness way of doing things. And I did, but I didn't get any better. And part of that was just the situation I was in with an aunt who I also believe had scrupulosity. And, but the darkness and the scrupulosity took over my life. And it's hard to describe those years. They were just the darkest things in my life. I had no hope at all that I could have peace with God, but I wanted it. And I loved God through it all. I loved God and never blamed God. I just knew it was me. And so after graduating from high school, I went off to college. It was at the college that was part of this conservative holiness church. And there, again, the preaching was find what you need to sacrifice to show God you're serious. And so I tried. I begged God, show me what I need to do. And there was nothing, no silence. And I would lay down flat on the floor, begging God, show me, please save me, anything. And nothing. I felt nothing. I would sit in church services and feel nothing. And so I interpreted that as I must really be sinful. I must really be evil.
There's an extra component there, though, isn't there? In that conservative holiness church, you almost had to feel blessed. Like you had to have that outward expression of emotion. So it's not just, for context here, it's not just that you're not feeling emotion, which could potentially be normal for someone else. But in the context of this church, if you're not feeling that, if you're not expressing that, then you must not actually be feeling God. You must not have him around you.
Right. Because there was a very charismatic kind of interaction with God where, like during the singing, people would raise hands or even run the aisles or any number of things. And, people would be weeping and crying and I would feel nothing. And I talk in my book more about that and how that comes from some of my childhood experiences with my dad and my dad's silent treatment really strongly affected me that way. But yeah, and so at college I decided, well, one of the things that people with scrupulosity really struggle with, there's several. One is a fear of blaspheming, that will blaspheme the Holy Spirit and be doomed forever. And along with that is, oh dear, my mind went blank. Fear of blasphemy. Well, and the fear of that you'll go to hell.
Yeah.
And so of committing the unpardonable sin, which is blaspheming the Holy Spirit. And so I became convinced that because I couldn't find God and I couldn't find peace with God, that I must have somewhere along the line committed the unpardonable sin. I had no idea how it had happened or what it was even. I just knew that's the only explanation, is I must have committed the unpardonable sin and I'm going to go to hell. There's no other choice. And another thing that I picked up over the years was, well, the more you sin, the worse your punishment in hell is going to be. And so logically, I thought, well, I'm going to hell anyway. I don't want my punishment to be any worse. So I am going to go ahead and go to hell now and get it over with. So I don't add any more punishment. And so I did attempt to take my life. And thankfully, it, I'm still here, and I was not successful.
Very
And I'm
thankful.
very thankful for that, because you wouldn't be here.
Exactly.
Delightful person that you are.
Not that I'm the entire reason for you to live.
No, but you're a good reason. And I managed, only a couple of people at the college knew about it, and they were very supportive through it. But there were no answers, just more, you need to pray more, you need to have faith, you need to trust God, you need to not let Satan confuse you, you need to find what you need to show God that you're serious. And it just was unrelenting. And I did manage to make it through college and graduated. And then I came home to Idaho. I was just going to be here for 2 weeks, on my way back up to live with family and to take a job. And while I was here, my childhood sweetheart happened to be in town, and we ran into each other. And the short story is 11 days later, we got married.
The short story.
The short story. And it was a short story, 11 days worth. And I don't recommend that, but it was great for us. And we've been married now 37 years. But with that, so he was in the military. So immediately we went back to his base where he was stationed. And my worst fear happened. He went to work and I was alone in the house. And at that point, I had a mental breakdown because I couldn't handle being alone. I was terrified. And I reached a point I developed agoraphobia. I could not leave my house.
For those who don't know, what is agoraphobia?
So agoraphobia is fear of the marketplace. Essentially, it's the fear of going outside of your house, fear of embarrassing yourself or doing something to draw attention to yourself or whatever. And that was all part of it.
So kind of like a fear of any social interaction.
Yes, fear of any social interaction, fear of stepping outside of my house. I could not even step out the front door. And at the worst point, I could not even go to the restroom by myself. I would have to wait till your dad, my husband, came home from work for lunch, and then I could go to the restroom. And then I would come back out and sit on the couch. I lost all personal feeling of identity. I had no personal identity. And I transferred all of that at that point onto Norm. And the amazing thing, I still find it very amazing, is as long as I was with Norm, I was normal. We went to church, we went shopping, we went places. As long as I was with him, I could function. But if he was not there, I had no sense of personal identity. So I did not function at all, even in my own house.
I have a couple interesting thoughts there. First, going back even all the way to the start, talking about that, like your mind betraying yourself. Mm-hmm. And feeling like there's complete separation between you and God because you've committed the unpardonable sin or something. I go back to what I said earlier, where it feels like there's a very social aspect to scrupulosity, where if you feel cut off from God, then you can't talk to him, reach to him to see what am I supposed to be doing, because he's not going to answer mm-hmm. you, or so your mind tells you. Then, and you don't trust yourself because your mind's betraying you. You have to project that out and take your identity on other people to feel like you have any sort of identity. Mm-hmm. So that tracks and makes sense to me. Yeah. I can see how that kind of develops there. And then as far as being fine around Dad, the Bible talks very much about Christ being the head of the church, mm-hmm. the church being the body, and the church in Christ kind of as the model for marriage. Mm-hmm. So I can see, because you studied the Bible a lot, reading, yeah. rereading, and rereading. So I can see there can be some symbology there that would kind of tie back into something that feels safe, structured, modeled after Christ's intentions, that would allow you to place some faith in that relationship a little bit, while also having that identity form, because you didn't feel like you were feeling God.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's another aspect of it too, and that was growing up, I heard the verse repeated over and over: the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? So I learned not to trust myself at all, that I could not trust anything I thought or felt. And so I had to have someone outside of myself. And I talk in my book about many years later, it's actually been maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I was at a Bible study with Dr. Diane LeClaire. She's a she's a theologian and a theology professor at Northwest Nazarene University, and she was leading a Bible study, and she was talking about how so a lot of us grew up hearing that pride is the root of all sin, and how if you think about it, you have all these women who have low self-esteem, who have no pride and no self-esteem. And so she developed a thought that maybe idolatry is the root of all sin. So idolatry of self or idolatry of others. So for idolatry of self, a lot of men especially, that tends to be more their sin, where they're very self-sufficient. They don't need anybody. They can do it themselves. They don't need God to save them.
That's that kind of
They
pride
can save themselves,
manifestation.
that pride manifestation. But for women, we have idolatry of others. So we find our identity, instead of finding our identity in God, we find it in others. And it's only been maybe 6 or 7 years ago that I really came to understand that that is what I was doing. And there was no, oh, I'm an awful person. There was none of that, because this was a skill I learned as a child. I learned to be whoever people expected me to be so that I could stay off the radar and not have conflict. And so I didn't develop a personal identity. And so having someone, again, I mentioned in the book when you were born, so you were my firstborn, I still had agoraphobia.
Mm-hmm.
But when you were born, all of a sudden I could move around my house again. I had another human being there with me, and I had an identity again. And so for much of my life, I did not have a personal identity. It was found in my husband, in my children, in even my grandchildren after they were born. And my healthy identity really has only developed in the last 6 or 7 years. And it has been an incredible transformation for me to become the person I was always meant to be. And it's a lot of hard work and a lot of unlearning that early way of surviving.
Yeah.
And of allowing Christ to build an identity in me and to become who he always created me to be. It's been a wonderful thing to happen.
Yeah.
And I have joy for the first time, in the last 6 or 7 years, and an identity. And I go places now. Social anxiety, we'll go back to that for a minute, because you mentioned, social anxiety. Not everyone with scrupulosity has social anxiety. That was just one of mine, was this severe social anxiety where afraid to be seen in public, afraid that I would do something stupid or say something stupid or look stupid or whatever. Just, I was not comfortable in my own skin at all.
And I wonder if that's somewhat tied back to that conservative holiness church. Like, they placed a lot of emphasis in some ways on your visual image. Like, women can only wear dresses. Mm-hmm. You can't cut your hair. Men have to wear pants. Like, you can't wear shorts. There was a lot of those physical presentations. So with scrupulosity, I could see that being a compounding effect. If I do something, I'm going to cause... I would bet you go back to the Bible verse, do not put a stumbling block in someone else's path. So if I dress just wrong and cause someone to stumble, then I've caused them to sin, which means I've now sinned because I've put that stumbling block. I can imagine a lot of those scenarios just playing through your mind with every single interaction with people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And a funny one of that is, so for many, many years, one of my obsessions was I would be out walking around, even with Dad or whatever, just wherever I was, and wonder, oh, did I put clothes on today? It was just that kind of in the background kind of trick that your mind plays on you, and with so much emphasis on the outward and being made fun of. So I was made fun of by my relatives, for my hair. I didn't know how to do my hair. And so they would make fun of me and laugh at me and, laugh at my clothes. We were very poor. So I was laughed at a lot for my poor clothing and that kind of stuff as a very young child. That leaves an impression. And so, yeah, there a lot went into forming the social anxiety, and that on top of the scrupulosity was just, scrupulosity took that and ran with it.
Well, OCD by its nature is an anxiety
Yes,
disorder. So it's not, in some ways, it's not two different anxieties. It's
right.
taking one anxiety and then amplifying it through another anxiety
Yeah.
exponentially.
Yeah, and it's just anxiety on top of anxiety. And it's not fun. And then you have, if you've been raised in the church, quite often you'll be told, well, don't be anxious about anything. Bible says be anxious about nothing. And so you heap the guilt on for anxiety. I had this conversation with one of my relatives here recently. He quoted that verse to me, and I had the opportunity to share with him that there is anxiety that, yes, is from not trusting God. But there's also anxiety that's physical.
Yep.
That is a brain issue. That's a misfiring in your brain that you don't have control over. And you have to learn how to deal with it. And I may always have anxiety at some level. I expect I'll always have scrupulosity at some level. But you learn ways of dealing with it and functioning, and you don't need guilt heaped on you for having an anxious thought.
Yeah. No, anxiety can be crippling, and especially when it's a mental illness, not just I'm choosing to be anxious about something, but literally something you can't change in your mind. It's just
Yeah, there's no reason. You're like,
hounds
why are
you.
you anxious? I have nothing. My life is great. Everything's going well. What is this ball of anxiety that has me just completely paralyzed almost? And
Yeah.
then you come to realize, no, it's because of my brain, the way my brain is functioning. There's nothing I am anxious about. It's just anxiety.
Just plagues you.
Yeah.
I was thinking a little bit back on our conversation and a little foreshadowing, going back to that social aspect of it and the people pleasing and needing to find your identity in others, compounded by not feeling like God sees you.
Mm-hmm.
You, I can see you placing identity in religious leaders to tell you
Mm-hmm.
how to do that, not just in anybody. Like, I assume you're avoiding confrontation with anybody from your social
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, but especially with a religious leader, because they're going to be able to give you the answers. They're going to give you that relief or answer on whether something you're doing is wrong or right or
Mm-hmm.
whatever that may be. So how did you cope with that growing up?
Well, one of the things about religious scrupulosity OCD is that it doesn't generally show up first in the counselor's office. It shows up in the pastor's office or at home to your parents. So for children who develop scrupulosity, they'll start confessing sin to their parents a lot. For those that are a little older, quite often it's their pastor. So it shows up in the pastor's office, like you say, because who do you take your spiritual issues to? You take them to your pastor or a Sunday school teacher or a trusted person at the church. And so I would go and talk with them about it. But there was another aspect of the pastor thing that I should mention. In the conservative holiness church, the pastors were like up here next to God. That is how they were portrayed. We had to respect them as God's messenger to us. And so you didn't question religious authority.
Almost like the Old Testament priests.
Yeah. You just didn't question them. What they said, that's what you went with. And so you didn't. I was actually scared to interact with my pastors, because I wouldn't say scared so much as I didn't feel like I was worthy to take up time and space in people of authority. But I also needed relief for my religious things. So I would go to my pastors and talk with them, but it was always a fearful thing that I'm taking up their time. I'm just a bother. So I had those two dynamics where I needed it, but I was ashamed of needing it.
Yep.
And one of the things that happens quite often with scrupulosity is that pastors want to help. They
Yes.
truly want to help. And the ways that they help people without scrupulosity are different than they would help a person with scrupulosity. So, for instance, I talk about assurance. So, a person with scrupulosity is looking for certainty. I need to be absolutely certain I have confessed my sins right. I need to be absolutely certain that God loves me. I need to be absolutely certain that I am doing everything right and I'm not sinning. And so, if a pastor gives them reassurance, well, of course you're doing well. I can see what a committed Christian you are. I wish everyone in my congregation was like you,
Because
was as
that
conscientious
OCD.
of you. That settles our anxiety down. Oh, we are doing okay. But then, because that feels good, then the next time that anxiety raises, what happens? We have to go back to our pastors to get that. It becomes almost like a drug. Um, I say assurance is exactly like a drug to a person with scrupulosity. And the more we get it, the more we have to seek it out.
Yep.
And if pastors, by and large, pastors don't know about religious scrupulosity, they don't know it's a mental illness and they don't recognize it as such. And they can actually do a lot of harm in trying to help. And that is what happened with me. Once I got away from the conservative holiness church and started speaking with my pastors in the Nazarene church, they all wanted to help me and they all did their absolute. I had incredible pastors who wanted to help me find that assurance, but what they offered was assurance, and it at times made my scrupulosity worse.
Yep.
There were some of the times they got things perfectly wonderfully right and helped me tremendously, and other times the assurance aspect was there and caused me more damage. And it's the same with my counselors. So I did off and on about 20 years of counseling before I knew about scrupulosity. This is for the depression, for the other, I had other types of OCD. You know, I had the hand washing, the locking the doors. I had the agoraphobia. I had the deep depression and low self-esteem and all of those things. So I was in counseling off and on for 20 years. The scrupulosity was never identified because I didn't talk to them about my spiritual issues. But they would, in not, although there was one particular counselor I did see who was a Christian counselor, and he was fabulous. He helped me tremendously with a lot of things. But he made the mistake of offering me assurance from a religious perspective. And I became very dependent on that. And it ended up being very harmful to me. And so as a as I lead workshops and stuff about scrupulosity, I always warn pastors and counselors, set good boundaries with people with scrupulosity, because you'll harm us, and in turn we will wear you out.
Because you'll just keep coming
We'll
knocking
just
for
keep
more
coming back
reassurance.
over and over. We drive our pastors crazy. We really do. We are difficult people um, when you have scrupulosity, because you're so desperate for relief, and your pastors offer relief, and they can't. They need to not do that, and that's one of the reasons why I talk so openly about my own story, is because I am committed to helping pastors and counselors know about this so that they don't make our suffering worse. The suffering is bad enough
Yeah.
without it being made worse by people who are actually trying to help.
Yeah. I would imagine it's even harder for pastors too, because anytime you bring something with OCD, you're going to study it more than other people. So I would imagine there's a lot of times where the person with scrupulosity is going to know the material, know the Bible, know whatever their religious text is better than the person they're going to talk to. And so I would imagine there's extra pressure on pastors like, how do I answer this
Yeah.
person that seems to know all the answers,
Hmm.
seems to already have a deep sense of all this? And so I would imagine a lot of times they're scrambling themselves just to try and, I don't know what to do here, deer in the headlights, but let me reassure you so we can both reassured. And it's like,
Hmm.
that doesn't sound like that is what you want to do at all for someone with scrupulosity.
No. And it can also, so if a pastor or a counselor is not healthy mentally themselves, they can be drawn into the cycle themselves because they're making somebody feel better, and that feels good.
Almost the savior
Yeah,
complex.
the savior complex, which is really common in pastors and in counselors. They all have to guard against that. And we're the perfect ones to come and bring that to them because then they make us feel better and then they feel better. But yeah, quite often a person with scrupulosity, they will know their scriptures or their holy books or their tenets of religion, their doctrines. They will know them verbatim because they've spent their whole life trying to make sure they measure up,
Yep.
make sure they are doing it all correctly. And yeah, I laughingly say I've probably read my Bible more than almost any pastor I've ever had because that's what you did. You read your Bible all the time.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I I did. I know the Bible. I know the doctrines. And so my questions are usually coming from not from a place of ignorance. They're coming from a place of knowledge that is like a double-edged sword.
And I would imagine it's a little deeper than that. Going back to different denominations, like the um, Conservative Holiness Church only used like the King James Bible, but
Yes.
then going to the Nazarene Church, they used NIV.
Mm-hmm.
But then you had studied some Greek, so you had read
Mm-hmm.
some of the Greek Bible. Um, I remember as a kid, I would get you different versions of different Bibles. Like I got you an archaeological study
Mm-hmm.
Bible. But how do all those different versions, or how does the concordances or other stuff that you're studying play into all that too? Because you're looking up to a lot of those religious leaders.
Well, it became so I laugh about when I first went into counseling. So I was fresh, well, I had graduated from college, I was married, I had two young children, and when I was first diagnosed with depression, um, so I knew my doctor, being a wise doctor, he prescribed me medication, which helped tremendously to allow me to start working on stuff. But then he also said you need to be in counseling. He recognized that medication was only going to go so far, that
Yep.
I needed counseling. And I remember thinking I have to find not just a Christian counselor, but I have to find a counselor that understands Wesleyan holiness. I have to get somebody that understands sanctification
Yep.
the right way because otherwise he's going to lead me wrong and I'm going to end up in hell anyway. So that dynamic can be really difficult. I have um, a relative who also has scrupulosity, and he struggles with even trusting his pastors because he knows the Bible so well, and he knows what he thinks so much, and he's part of a church that doesn't do counseling and doesn't recognize religious scrupulosity. And so it's challenging. It's challenging because you're driven by this. It's got to be exactly what I believe.
Yep.
And I don't dare read something else. I don't dare read a book that might have something in it that doesn't agree with what I already believe because I might be led astray.
Yeah.
And so there's this lack of trust in the Holy Spirit for those of us who trust in the Holy Spirit like that to lead us, or to trust ourselves. That's all lost. We don't trust ourselves and we don't trust anybody.
Yep.
And so we're afraid to. I remember when I started reading well, let me back up. So when I first married your dad, I had never read The Hobbit, ever, because it had wizards in it. Therefore, it was an evil book, and I was not allowed to read it because it was evil. Well, after I got married and Dad came to me and said, "Hey, have you ever read The Hobbit?" And I'm like, "No, I can't read that book." He's like, "Trust me, it's not a bad book. You can read it." And he went and bought me my first copy of The Hobbit, and I read it and loved it. And then he brought me the Lord of the Rings trilogy, one book at a time, and I read those and loved them and saw what incredibly deep books they are.
Yeah.
But that was a hard thing for me to do. I read them with fear at first. And anything I read, if it wasn't exactly from a Wesleyan holiness position, I was terrified to read it. I mean, how dare I read something that might be Calvinistic? What if I'm led astray,
Yeah.
and those kind of things. Or what if I read something that does have a wizard in it? What if I'm led astray? What if I read a magic spell and I'm now satanic? The fear is real.
Yeah.
And you lived through my years of Christian music.
Yep.
Where I was raised, you can only do hymns.
If you can tap your foot to it,
there's too much
if you
rhythm.
can play drums to it, it's of the devil.
Yeah, drums were of the devil. That was how I was raised. And I can remember hearing them and just being sick to my stomach and thinking, "Oh no, Satan's attacking me because I am feeling this." Well, what I was feeling was anxiety.
Yep.
Caused by the scrupulosity. But I wouldn't let you listen to Christian music on the radio, if it wasn't hymns. And, whether you followed my advice or not, that's another story. But
I remember getting in trouble a couple times. I remember getting in trouble for, I think, Casting Crowns,
which
is
I now
one of your
love.
favorites.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had an interesting thought through all that. So jumping a little bit ahead, but you ended with a really good relationship with your dad.
Yes.
But when I first moved back to Idaho, I moved in with them for a couple months. And at the time, I was wanting to write a little bit and working on different philosophy stuff I was thinking through. I had just gone through my associate's degree. And one of the things I was working on was actually, how do you select a counselor? Because implicit in that is you're saying, I have something wrong with me. But how do I know who can fix me? They need to have the right value system. So I need to know what they know so that I know they know the right thing to help me out.
Yeah.
And you end up in this complete mind twist where it's like, I can't select a counselor because I'm putting trust in them inherently by going them saying they can fix me, which means I need to know their value systems, which I need to know those are lined up and perfect, but I don't trust my own mind right now to know my value system. So how can I make that judgment?
Welcome to my world.
And so it's a funny aside. I don't know if you ever knew that, but
I
I was
didn't know
working
that.
on writing a paper about that back at the time with
Yeah.
your dad,
Yeah.
with Grandpa.
That is my world on every level.
I can very much see that early when you're first going to that counselor, how hard that must have been right there.
Yeah, it was.
And I know in the book you mentioned actually the church you were attending at the time didn't support counseling.
Right.
I know there was a lot of churches that took the approach of there's no such thing as mental illness. It's just a spiritual issue.
Yes.
You need to just pray it away. And so I know you actually switched to a Baptist church for a while.
Yes, we did. So we were, the one bad experience we had at a Nazarene church, at the base we were stationed at, we were attending a Nazarene church. I was still following all the rules of the other church, of the Conservative Holiness Church. And so we were, there was none of those anywhere near, so I was attending the Nazarene church. And when I knew I needed counseling, we went to our pastor and asked, "Can you recommend a Christian counselor?" And his response was, "I don't believe in counseling. If you'll just pray, God will take care of your needs." And I have never been one to jump churches and run around to different churches and and try different churches. I that's not part of my value system. But at that point, I knew if I was going to get help, I had to change churches. And we were in an area where there were very few Christian churches. And so we ended up attending a Baptist church, which was a really interesting, I was terrified because I'm like, what if I come to believe Calvinism and what I discovered instead was these wonderful, wonderful people. I remember picking up the bulletin the first week, and here's Alcoholics Anonymous group listed, and a codependent group listed, and survivors sorts of groups. There was a whole list of people who were admitting they had problems, and the church was there providing avenues for them for healing.
Instead of preaching hell, meeting them where they're at.
Well, and instead of saying, if you'll just pray, if you'll just read your Bible more, you'll be fine.
Yep.
And recognizing mental illness. It was my first experience with a church that recognized mental illness as not a spiritual issue that you're just trying to get out of obeying God, but that was really something, and providing room and space and resources. So our 3 or 4 years, I think we went there before we moved, were some of the best healing in my early healing that allowed me those initial steps of starting into counseling and starting to let people know what I was going through. The people at that church, several of them knew that I had agoraphobia, that I could scarcely leave my house alone. And I managed at one point to join the choir. And so I would drive to choir practice terrified the whole time. And well, one time I was there and I found I couldn't leave the church building after the choir. I was too terrified to go get in my car and drive home. And so one of the pastor's wives came and got in my car with me and rode with me the whole way to my house. And the pastor followed, and I had to get them on base because we lived on base. And they just didn't treat me like I had done anything wrong. They were totally supportive.
Just
walked alongside of me. And through many of those situations, I would get to church and just be paralyzed. And they would walk me through it. You know, sometimes this happened actually just a couple weeks ago. Interestingly enough, I was leading a workshop at PALCON, which is Pastors and Leaders Conference at Northwest Nazarene University. And we had plenary sessions where we all gathered together and in a local church. And I went into the church and I couldn't make myself enter the sanctuary because I was alone. I didn't have I wasn't there as an official part of a church. I was there as a workshop leader. And so I didn't really have a connection of somebody set ahead of time to go sit with. And so I would start to enter the church and I would stop and go back out and, start to enter again. So I still struggle. But then my youth pastor and his wife from clear back when I was a child, they were here for the conference, and they're like, come sit with us. And they knew what was going on. They recognized that I wasn't able to enter the church. So even to this day, I will have glitches and have people that come alongside me and work me through them instead of, well, what's wrong with you? Just go sit down. Stop being anxious. Be anxious about nothing.
Because as a kid, what goes through my mind, what would have gone through your head or earlier in your life is, I can't enter the sanctuary. Well, I must have some sin in my life, like that I can't enter the sanctuary.
Well, it wasn't so much about sin for me. It was the social anxiety, the fear of appearing stupid, or a fear of being noticed. For most of my life, my goal was to be invisible, to not be noticed. And so that fear creeps back sometimes. Most of the time, I move on and don't worry about it. But every once in a while, in a situation like that, I'll glitch and
I am. Slide funny aside, I am curious because you've been on a lot of praise teams singing
Mm-hmm.
with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I used to play bass for several of them.
Right.
And one of the things I picked up, specifically at one particular church, is the praise team and worship band should not be noticed. It should be almost as if you're not there. You should blend into the background because so we all, at least on the band especially, we had to wear the
Mm-hmm.
same outfit. You don't want to stand out. You want to blend into the background.
Right.
Um, at another church, several churches that I was at, it's if you're running sound, if anybody notices anything, you're doing it wrong. So I'm imagining some of this playing into you being up
Mm-hmm.
there on the praise team. How do you get up and sing in front of people, but you want to not be noticed because you're not trying to bring attention to you. You're
Mm-hmm.
trying to give it all to God, but you're
Right.
doing this standing in front of people.
It's been amusing to me over the years that that is one thing I was able to do. But I started singing in front of people when I was a very young child. So there wasn't a social anxiety as much attached to that. That was a natural thing I did as a young child. I think had I not done it as a young child, I would never would have been able to do that. And I still sometimes I'm like, how is it I could do that in the midst of all this the social anxiety I had? But singing in front of people has never been one of those things that really bothers me.
What?
It's one of the few things that didn't.
I'm curious if it's somewhat because it's such a social norm in that position that you can do it without standing out. Not doing it almost makes you stand out more. So it's very natural to step into it and just be a part of the social norms where
Hmm.
you're not standing out making a difference.
Yeah.
It's like if you're not usually a clapper, but everyone around you clapping, you're going to clap along with so you don't stand out. So
Yes.
why not sing? Why not get involved? Those who really get involved get a part of the praise
Hmm.
team. And I don't really mean that anybody who wants to get involved has to go do that. But
Yeah.
when you have all this pressure, it's like, no, if I really want to do this, I need to be on the board or I need to be on
Hmm.
the praise team. I need to be part of every group and plug into every aspect. So I could very easily see that being
That
easy
could
to do
be.
in that
Yeah.
sense.
And I'm sure there are people that do, but there's starting to be this phenomena recognized among pastors that there is a percentage of pastors that likely go into ministry because of scrupulosity.
I can
In
see
order
that.
to deal with the scrupulosity, they think this is what I have to do in order to deal with the scrupulosity. And it's starting to be recognized that there's a percentage of pastors that struggle with scrupulosity themselves. And but for me, I think I have always loved to sing and always, even to this day, this I don't believe is a scrupulous part of myself that believes in participation, full participation in church life, in what's going on at church. So if you have a gift, it's not for just you, that you share your gifts within the body.
Yeah.
That it, within the Christian church, we talk about the body of Christ, and that we're all part of the body of Christ, and that we have our gifts in order to edify the body, not for just us. And so I've always had a strong commitment to be participating wherever I felt I could. And were there years that I did stuff from a scrupulosity standpoint? Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Oh,
And
yeah.
those were life sucking to me. But when I have being on praise teams, being involved with worship ministries, has always been very life giving to me. I love theology. I love thinking about things and thinking about theology and that kind of stuff. Has always been, in spite, even if I didn't have scrupulosity, I think I would have been very involved with worship ministry type of stuff, the theology of worship and why we do that.
I I have another curiosity actually on the music side.
Hmm.
I have a book I can maybe lend you. I need to go back and reread it. I haven't read it in years, but this is Your Brain on
I
Music.
read it years ago
Um,
when you first got it.
and one of the things I'm thinking through this, you look at music, if you get Alzheimer's or
Hmm.
dementia, you can play, they won't recognize even necessarily music that they listen to as an adult, but they'll especially it tends to be, I want to say, the ages of 13 to 14, music
Mm-hmm.
that you heard in that period. If you play that, even patients who are like in a coma, their brain starts lighting up.
Mm-hmm.
um, Music activates, normally you have the left and right hemispheres, art or critical thinking. Music is actually one of the few things that activates your entire brain.
Right.
So where scrupulosity is in some ways like a brain disorder, your mind's attacking itself. I'm wondering if the music portion gets past some of what your brain's putting in your way.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious if there's some way to use music in some of that healing process.
I have used music as part of the healing process. So one of the difficult parts of music for me is slower music depresses me.
Yep.
So hymns that are done slowly or music that is done slowly can really affect me mentally. It's not anything I have control over. It just is what it does to my brain. And I mean, there's even, I looked it up one time, there's even slow music can make people angry. It affects the emotions. But
Yep.
by the same token, so I don't think I share this in the book, but um, so I mentioned earlier that could only listen to hymns.
Mm-hmm.
So we were living down in Mountain Home, actually, and we were stationed at Mountain Home Air Force Base. And I was in counseling at the time. I was struggling terribly with depression. And my Christian counselor at that time told me, turn on the Christian radio station and listen to it. It was contemporary Christian, had Casting Crowns and Mercy Me and those. And I'm like, I can't do that. That's not real Christian music. And he's like, trust me, just when you are depressed, just turn it on and listen to it. And one day I was so depressed, I decided I was going to go drive out in the middle of the desert. Of course, Idaho is desert. Drive out in the middle of the desert, drive till I ran out of gas, and then just stay out there until I died. And it was a grand plan. And so I started driving, and my counselor's voice just kept ringing in my head. Turn the Christian radio station on, turn it on. And so finally, I turned the Christian radio station on. And the song, it was just fresh out, was, it starts out, why are you crying these days? Why are you striving to earn faith? I'll be by your side. I can't,
Voice of truth.
not voice of
No.
truth. It's right on the tip of my tongue. But anyway, I'll be by your side whenever you call. And that song was playing, and it instantly, it brought hope to me. I am not alone. God is here with me. I am not alone. And I started from that day forward listening to the Christian radio station. And I found when I was depressed or struggling, if I turned on a more upbeat music, that it could get me through over the hump of the depression and the anxiety. And so I still use music that way. If I am really feeling down, I'll turn on a very upbeat music and even move to it, which is Nazarenes can't dance. Not because it's sinful, but we just can't, as we like to say. But yeah, music has been very much a healing part of my journey. And sorry for not letting you listen to Casting Crowns.
I snuck in different music. You probably don't remember from Washington. I listened to the OC Supertones, which was a ska band.
No,
So
I've
trumpet,
blocked this from my
trombone,
mind.
electric guitar, drums. I think that was my first step out of what we were allowed to listen to as kids was OC Supertones. But I remember listening to a lot of classical growing up. I think I had a
Yes,
collection of 25 or 30 classical CDs.
right.
And I stopped being able to listen to classical for a long time because it was like, this is all you can listen to. That's it. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. You can't listen to any of this other stuff. And so then I
Yeah.
in Mountain Home, when you stepped into some of your music like that, I actually stepped into some different ones. Like I found some Christian rap
Yes, I
artists
do
and
remember the rap.
some Christian heavy metal, and I went to everything you could think of. Anything that wasn't bluegrass, gospel, or classical.
Uh-huh.
I
Yep.
think at one time I was known in Mountain Home in the youth group is if you wanted a style of music, ask Brenton. He knows the Christian version of it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but that's all a funny aside.
Yeah.
I definitely think music can play a huge part in people's minds.
Yes.
A funny side note is if you can tap your feet to it or if it has drums, it's evil. But you let us listen to classical, which has the timpanis and other percussion, and that always
Yes.
kind of amused me.
Somehow my mind did not make that connection in the same way.
No, it was. I found plenty of music to listen to in whatever genre growing up. It all worked out.
Hmm.
But to tie us back in, we were last talking in Utah when you started going to the Baptist church, and there was a funny story there. You had talked about idols being the root of sin
Hmm.
instead of
Idolatry.
pride.
Hmm.
And one of the only memories I have from that church was being in the children's choir, and we were singing Might as Well Pray to a Bale of Hay,
Yeah.
talking about
The King
Baal is an idol.
Josiah and yeah, King
Yeah.
Josiah
So it's
musical.
interesting you're saying
Yeah.
some of this, and it ties back in interestingly.
Right.
But so after, like during some of that time, I know in the book you mentioned you couldn't even go to the grocery store and select
No.
like a can of green beans.
No, part of my scrupulosity rendered me incapable of making decisions because for a person with scrupulosity, there's only one right answer to any question, to anything. There's only one right answer. So not everybody's scrupulosity ends up like this, but for me, so I talk about the can of green beans. So I'm in the grocery store. I would have panic attacks in the grocery store trying to choose a can of green beans because in my mind there was only one can of green beans that was the right one, and it wasn't this, oh, God has a plan for which can of green beans I can pick and I have to figure out which one God wants me to pick. It was that, oh, the green beans themselves, there were only a certain one that Christians would pick. So for instance, if I pick this one, the generic, it has bits and pieces in it that, a vine, and your dad didn't like those. And so if I'm loving, I won't pick those. I can't pick this one because they might support something immoral and I don't know, so I might be supporting something immoral if I pick that one. And this one's overpriced, and which one, so out of all these bad choices, which one is the only right good choice? And I couldn't even pick a can of green beans.
Did that present even which grocery store to go to? Because different stores would have different selections, or was it more just once you're in the moment
Was
in
more
there?
so just in the moment. I mean, we were not very rich back when Dad was a young airman, and so we shopped wherever it was the cheapest. And
I remember growing up, a treat was going to the thrift store and getting a 25-cent
yep,
book.
yep. And so yeah, but it was once I was in the store. I mean, it was at home. It was when you kids would come up and ask, "Can I go outside and play?" What's the right answer to that? Is it okay for, what if something bad happens to them and I told them they could go outside and play? Then I was evil for letting them go outside and play. I was not a good Christian hearing God's voice. And I don't, what's for dinner? That would shut me completely down because I could open the pantry. As soon as I opened the pantry door, the overwhelming choices would just shut me down. And people talk a lot about, well, the women cook. No, in our house, Dad cooked. Um, it started out because I couldn't make a choice to cook. I couldn't function. And so he, without any complaint, without any making me feel bad at all, without shaming me in any way, shape, or form, he took over the cooking. And that bled over into the grocery buying. I didn't go grocery shopping by myself. I couldn't. Not only because I couldn't leave my house by myself, but because I couldn't make the choices. So we always went grocery shopping together, and he could pick up the slack of doing that. I couldn't handle meat for many years, and so he naturally cooked because I couldn't handle the meat because of the germs. And just what I wear today, is the color purple going to cause me to be proud of how I look? Am I going to sin by being proud? If I do something right and somebody gives me a compliment, oh no, I'm going to let pride grow in my heart and I'm going to sin. And so just daily living was awful. The thoughts of, if I'm bathing my child and I could drown my child, the thoughts that happen. So I mentioned earlier about thought action fusion and how thoughts enter our head. So we gather thoughts all the time. As we're driving down the street, we see billboards, we see signs, we see stuff on TV, we see magazines. Our brains are gathering information all the time. And sometimes it'll just make a connection and spit out something that's irrelevant. And most people can just dismiss it. But for a person with scrupulosity, as I mentioned, we think if we thought the thought that we're guilty of the action. So fighting intrusive thoughts, because the thing with thoughts is the more you try not to think them, the more you think them.
It's the pink elephant.
It's the pink elephant in the room. You don't try not to think about the pink elephant. So what are you going to picture? A pink elephant. And the more you try not to, the more that you do. So in recovering from scrupulosity and recovering from intrusive thoughts like that, you have to learn to not react to them. To just say, okay, there's a bad thought. There it is. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to quote scripture. Growing up, you hear, well, Jesus fought off temptation by quoting scripture. So you should always quote scripture if you need to fight off temptation. Well, that's nice for common folk, for regular folk, but for those with scrupulosity, that's bad advice. Because then you have to keep quoting the scripture, and then the thought keeps coming back, and the more you fight it, the more it comes back. And so you have to learn not to react to it, which is a really difficult thing. That's where counseling is really helpful in teaching you the skills to ignore the bad thoughts and ignore, blasphemous thoughts are really common. Blasphemous thoughts about God, they will enter your mind and whatever. So it seems with scrupulosity, it's common that whatever your particular tenets of faith cover, that's where your problems will be. So like
that would be denominational, even. Like whatever is most taboo within that specific, even within a specific church of a denomination, wherever you're at, whatever's most taboo, that's going to be a sort of focus. And so then you're worried about not having that into your mind. So then it's that pink elephant. Now you think about it.
And then you think you're evil for thinking about it. And it causes this vicious cycle. And, it's just learning to deal with those kind of thoughts are one of the most difficult, especially the blasphemous thoughts are one of the most difficult, because you're afraid, well, I had a blasphemous thought, therefore I must have, blasphemed the Holy Spirit, and I'm doomed. And learning, no, that wasn't my thought. It was just a thought that came into my head. I had no will behind it, and I'm not going to keep thinking about it. I'm not going to ward it off.
Yeah.
And the less you try and ward it off, the less you actually think about it.
This brings me to something. I don't know if you told me this as a kid or if I picked it up somewhere else, but you don't want to meditate, because if you're quiet, if you're silent, then Satan's going to slip into your mind.
That is what I was taught.
And so I remember there were times where it's like, men have what's called like the nothing box. Like there's times we just literally think about nothing. But I remember internalizing that for a while. And it's like, well, I need to fill this with something. What do
Mm-hmm.
I think about? What do I focus on? What do like?
Yeah. Silence is a spiritual discipline, and meditation is a spiritual discipline that many religions use. But I was taught within the Conservative Holiness Church that meditation is wrong, and that an idle mind is the devil's workshop. So you don't ever just sit and meditate. And I was terrified of it. Silence terrified me because the thoughts would start coming. And prayer was difficult because as soon as I would start to pray, awful thoughts would start coming into my mind. There were years I couldn't pray at all. I'm like, well, how can I be a Christian? I'm not praying. But I couldn't pray because then bad thoughts would happen. And so it's finding that balance of saying, okay, I'm going to pray. If a bad thought happens, well, it's there, and well, God, you know me, you know my thoughts. Here's a bad thought. I'm not going to try and ward it off, so I'm going to keep praying.
In your book, you likened it to your brain is like a stream.
Yes.
Everyone has sticks floating down, but with scrupulosity, it's like if the stick's there, it's not a stick that floats. It's a tree that suddenly appears in the middle, and it's just stuck there.
Yeah, and you've
And you
got to
have to
get it
let
out.
those, instead of focusing on not noticing the tree, you just need to let the stream flow.
Yeah.
It flows on instead of sticking.
Yep. And it's a difficult thing to learn, but it is possible. It's possible to learn, and counseling helps with that. I learned that skill back before I ever knew I had scrupulosity. I learned it with my other OCD things, like washing your hands. Okay, I just have to live with the knowledge that I might not have got them 100% clean.
Yep.
And keep going. I can't go back. And so, like I mentioned the scripture reading earlier, when I was getting over that particular obsession of I have to read every word, I would allow myself to reread it one time. And it didn't matter if I still thought I missed a word or whatever. I could reread it one time and then move on. Now I don't even generally even reread it. I just move on.
Yeah.
And not worry about it. But it's a skill that has to be learned, and to not react to things, yeah.
The image that comes to my mind is from the show Monk.
Yes.
Where he's walking along, touching each sign. He misses one. I gotta go back, touch it.
Uh-huh.
I gotta go back, touch it.
Yeah, there are people who will get stuck. There's a lot of people with scrupulosity who can't go to church because they'll get there, and let's say they're a Catholic and they need to cross themselves, genuflect, I think it's called, and they will do it over and over and over and get caught in this. Am I doing it right? Am I doing it with the proper reverence? And they will do it over and over, hundreds of times in a row. I had a friend that years ago, back before I knew about scrupulosity or really even OCD, I'm pretty sure she had OCD. And one of the things that she would do, every intersection she came to, she would cross herself. She was Catholic, and she had to cross herself at every intersection just in case there was a Catholic church down the road that she might not know about. And that's the kind of things that scrupulous people do. And you have to learn, well, there might be a church down there. I'm not going to cross myself, and I'm not going to go to hell for not crossing myself, and
now
living with uncertainty. It is absolutely learning to live with uncertainty.
Yep. I remember as a kid, I was diagnosed OCD.
Mm-hmm.
It was more environmental, situational on stuff I had going on, but I remember a couple tics that I had. If I touched my thumb to one finger, I had to touch the others an equal number of time. Or if the cracks between my fingers, those had to touch. So I refused to walk with my hands in my pocket because as you're walking, they'd bump and then you're thrown off. Wait, did they touch an equal number of times?
Yeah.
And I would pause, and it's almost like a panic. I don't know if I did it right, and I would shut down. But I notice actually, even to this day, if I'm particularly stressed, I've done it a couple times, even as my hand's been sitting here, where it's touched, and I start to do it. It's like, wait, stop, let it go.
Yeah.
but I still notice those things where, oh, they touched. Now I got to touch an equal number of times.
Well, one of my funnies is, so part of my OCD is counting everything. Don't even realize I'm doing it. I still do it to this day, especially if I'm very stressed. But I remember one time we were living up in Washington, and Dad was getting ready to go overseas, and we had to sell his car while he was at work. And I was absolutely terrified of lightning storms, terrified to go outside. Well,
Where was this at?
this was in Washington.
Okay, not
Yeah.
Tucson.
No, not Tucson, Washington State. And so we were having a storm. It was lightning but I had to go out and show Dad's car because Dad had to be at work. And I went out and just terrified, but I did go out. And as I'm walking along, I was going to pray. I knew I needed to pray and ask God's help. And so I started praying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I didn't even realize that's what I was praying until all of a sudden I'm like, wait, you're counting. But my counting was prayer in that moment. And I knew that God knew what was going on. But yeah, the strange things that we do with OCD that we don't even always recognize we're doing. I still, like I say, I'll count stuff. It's really helpful to know how many dishes you've loaded in the dishwasher. Very helpful.
I had a couple things. So my degree's in math, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that led me to math was I can't do it so much now, but I used to be able to look at any line in a ceiling and say, that's like half a centimeter higher on one side of the room than the other.
Yeah.
But then my mind would go further, and I wanted to go into geometry and calculus, and let's calculate the law of cosines. Let's calculate all these other things. Let's see if I can do the math in my head. I had this OCD thing where I had to do the math in my head. And I know that was frustrating to you homeschooling me because I didn't show any of my work. But I remember for the longest time, I had to do it in my head. It was, I'm an idiot. I'm stupid. I'm not smart unless I can do it in my head. And I was obsessed with that. I had to do it. It presented in counting tiles, I would just run math equations in my head. If I saw a number of ceiling tiles, I had to find different ways to calculate them. Not just how many were on the ceiling, but what are the different math problems I can make out of it, whether it's length times width, or are there patterns of threes, like breaking that apart into as many patterns as I could find in it.
OCD is a fun thing.
Yes. So going back to, we had talked about some of the green beans, and we're moving a little bit past that. That was Utah. I forget where you moved on from that in the book.
So from there, I had started in Tucson working on the agoraphobia and getting outside and doing stuff. I was in counseling for the other OCD and all of that kind of stuff, and started making good progress and started being able to function more and all of that stuff. And that continued. Every move that we made and every year that passed, I improved more and more, and then had some spiritual breakthroughs along the way that helped me progress, and but still wasn't diagnosed with scrupulosity until about 10 years ago.
That's a long road to walk with a lot of challenges.
Yes, it is.
I'm curious because most people don't know, but I know you homeschooled us, but I know there were a couple times you had some breakdowns. Like I remember middle of 3rd grade to end of 5th grade, because a lot of this caught up to you.
Yeah. Yeah, my social anxiety got severe, my depression got severe. And one of the issues I was having was the medications that they were putting me on were actually making me worse. So twice I ended up in the mental hospital psychotic because of a medication to help my depression. And I'm a big proponent for taking medication to help, but there are some people, and I'm one of them, that medication can actually have very detrimental effects on. And so during that time in Tucson, I didn't know that it was the medication, but it was making me really psychotic, and I was very, very depressed, and walked through some really dark times down there. And thankfully, I had a wonderful church family that cared for me through all of that. It was actually Pastor David who took me down to the mental hospital, convinced me to go to the mental hospital, and took me, and then came and visited me every single day while I was in, and just was so encouraging. And but once I was off the medications,
A lot of it resolved.
a lot of that resolved, but the depression was still there, and it was. So what we didn't recognize through all of that is it was the scrupulosity that was causing the depression. It was the scrupulosity that was causing almost all the other issues. So until I got those dealt with, the depression and all was just going to keep coming back.
It's kind of like taking Tylenol to treat a headache when you have a misaligned back.
Yes, exactly. It's just going to keep coming back. And it did. It just kept coming back wherever we moved. I still was dealing with it. I would talk with my pastors about it, and at times do better, and then have times where I didn't do so well. Wasn't able to homeschool for a couple of years because I was too depressed. I couldn't function. Yeah, those were tough times. And then when we moved up to Mountain Home is when I really started having some spiritual breakthroughs that started making those changes. And even though the scrupulosity wasn't diagnosed yet, I started understanding grace a little more, and that I didn't have to work for everything, that I didn't have to earn my salvation, and that I was saved. I came to an assurance that I was saved and that I was right with God, and just kind of planted it and said, okay, I'm not revisiting that. And when it still tries to come back and haunt me every once in a while, I'm like, no, that's decided, not revisiting.
Yep.
And so I just refuse to revisit it. Although I have to say, when Franklin Graham comes on the TV and prays the sinner's prayer, I confess I still pray it with him, but it just feels strange not to.
Yeah.
But maybe someday I won't.
Some of that's just muscle memory almost.
Yes,
Just like
yes,
you're not
it
even
is.
thinking about it. It comes
Yep.
up, and that's what you do.
Exactly.
In the book, you talk about some of the time in Mountain Home, like part of going back to like the stream, letting thoughts just float through your head. Part of that is facing your fears.
Yes.
And that's part of the anxiety problem is I can't just let the stick go. I have to worry about it. I have to stress about it. So continuing on that journey, I know you started facing some of your fears in Mountain Home, especially when you went specifically to a women's retreat.
Yes. So when I say I was afraid of everything, I was afraid of everything. Anything that could cause death, I was afraid of. I was terrified. I couldn't climb up on a ladder. I could hardly climb up on a 2-step ladder or onto a chair. I was just terrified of heights and of other things. But I went to a ladies' retreat, and there was a zip line at the ladies' retreat. At the time, it was the longest in Idaho. It may still be, I don't know. But so to do the zip line, you had to climb up a tree like, I don't know, maybe 30 feet. And then you climbed out on this tiny little, it seemed like a postage stamp sized platform, and they hooked you up, and you went across on the zip line. Well, the ladies that I had from my church that went to that retreat with me, it was a women's retreat. They all decided they were going to do the zip line. And my social anxiety kicked in, and I'm like, I can't look stupid. So I can't say no, so I have to do the zip line, but how in the world am I going to do this zip line? And so the closer I got for my time to do it, I was terrified and shaking, but I'm like, I also have a very, very strong stubborn streak. that has stood me in good stead over the years. And this was one of those moments, because I'm like, okay, I will do it. So they hooked me up. I signed my life away on the form that said I won't sue them to death if I die. And I climbed up the tree, and that part wasn't bad. But as soon as I got on the platform, I started having panic attacks, and I was paralyzed. I could not move my body at all. Nothing. I was hugging the tree, and I could not move. If anybody's ever experienced panic attack where you are paralyzed, it was complete paralysis. I couldn't move. And the man that was up there helping and hooking me up, he was very kind. And he's like, there's only 2 ways to get down. You can climb back down the tree. And I knew there was no way I could do that. He's like, or you can do the zip line. And finally he said, well, you can sit down if that would be easier. You can sit down and scoot over the edge as opposed to stepping off.
Because you had to go off yourself, right?
You had
they
to,
couldn't push
yes.
you off or help you.
They would not push you. You had to do it on your own. You had to make the choice and do it. And so finally I'm sitting down there and I'm like, okay, God, here we go. And I pushed myself off the platform and went zipping along. And I share in the book that I had a moment of stubbornness where I made a Superman pose in defiance, and then I went back to sobbing my eyes out. But I got to the other side and survived, obviously. And once they unhooked me, I had started crying. I had started crying when I was having the panic attacks, but I cried for hours. I literally could not stop crying, and I didn't know why. I didn't know what had happened, and why it was that why I was crying.
Because you weren't an overly
I
emotional
wasn't. No,
person.
I say I cry once a year just to make sure everything works. I don't cry real often, but that time I couldn't stop, and I cried for hours and hours. And the one of the things that came out of that is I overcame my fear of heights, because I did it, and all of a sudden I wasn't afraid of heights anymore. I could walk along the edge of a cliff. I could climb ladders. I don't have that fear of heights anymore. But
Dad could take you on his 4-wheeling adventures
Dad
up
can
the
take
side
me
of a
on
cliff.
his, well, yeah, those are still frightening to a normal, healthy person. But I'm not afraid of the heights part of it anymore. But what came out of that is facing one of my worst fears. Started all my other fears and phobias just started melting away. I could kill a spider with my bare hand and not run away shrieking, finding someone to kill a minuscule spider.
Well, I'll admit fear on that one. I'll call you to kill the spider.
That'll work. I'll
But that
come
comes
kill it.
from being bitten and getting cellulitis
Yes.
and almost losing my arm.
Yes, that's a different story. But yeah, and plugging things in and not having to say the sinner's prayer before doing everything. I started overcoming and my goal is to overcome every phobia that I have. Every single one. And there's still some that are lingering, but one by one, as I realize them, I face them, and I am determined to overcome all of my phobias, because phobias held me captive for way too many years.
There is a lot of power in facing your fears.
Yes, there is a lot of power.
That's actually one of the reasons I have a tattoo is I was needle phobic.
Mm-hmm.
You say in the book, like, you couldn't hear someone curse or say bad words.
Right.
You had to scrub your mind out or things like that. I think one of the only times I ever let a bad word out around you was actually that spider bite I referenced. We were in the hospital and they had to draw blood, and they had to draw it from one arm, then the other, then go back to the other arm. And I think you were laughing just out of being nervous.
Yeah, I was nervous.
But it's like, Mom, it's not funny. And I swore at you. But it's like, I didn't want to live in that fear. So part of it was like, there was a lot of meaning involved in it. But part of it was actually, okay, I'm afraid of needles. Let me go get it hundreds and hundreds of times just so I can force myself to go face it.
Mm-hmm.
And
fortunately for you, because allergy shots.
yeah, now I get allergy shots, and The past 4 or 5 times I've gotten my blood drawn, it hasn't affected me.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember for a long time, even just the sight of the needle, they had to use smelling salts to
Yep.
keep me up.
I remember that.
I did not do
Yeah.
well with needles.
Yeah. Overcoming one fear helps the whole rest of your life. It gives you power. It takes your power back from that object.
I want to say it's called, have you heard of the parietal distribution?
Mm-mm.
Um, so most people think of like a normal distribution as like a bell curve where it's really
Mm-hmm.
shallow on the ends and then there's a normal average in the
Right.
middle. The parietal distribution is almost exponential. It's kind of like the hardest part is that first step. And they see
Mm-hmm.
this in a lot of stuff. And I may have the word wrong. It might not be parietal, but what I'm referring to is things typically accelerate once you start.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll see this in authors. Once they've written their first book, that hardest part, almost nobody's written a book.
Mm-hmm.
But once you've written one book, you're much more likely to write a second. Once you've
Right.
written two, you're much more likely. And so it's just getting that first step. And you see
Mm-hmm.
that with facing fears. When you
Yes.
face that first fear, now all of a sudden you find you have the courage because the internal story is, I don't have to be afraid of everything.
Mm-hmm.
I do have courage. I can face this first thing. Now I have strength to face more and more and more and
Right.
more.
Right. Yeah, it does. It cascades and it builds, and to find freedom is so incredible. It's just really incredible, that freedom that comes from not having to live fearful of everything.
Yeah. So as you got past some of that fear and moved forward, you started making a lot of progress, moved forward to where you actually discovered scrupulosity.
So when I discovered I had scrupulosity, so all those years I wondered, am I saved? Am all of that? And then I reached that milestone that I talked about where I just kind of drove a stake down and said, I'm not revisiting that. It would still try, but I just wouldn't go there. But then about 10 or 11 years ago, I was struggling again, and I had been part of an online Nazarene community for many years. Nasnet for many years, and I hadn't shared much on there, but I had started just in about 11 years ago, started sharing a few of the things that I was struggling with. And a lady on there, and I feel awful that I don't even remember her name, but she private messaged me and she said, you sound a lot like my husband, and he has this thing called religious scrupulosity, OCD. And so I am a researcher. I love research. So immediately I got on the computer and I started researching. And as I read, I'm like, this is my life story. This is me. Describes me to a T. And it was life-changing to realize there's something real here. I'm not an evil person. I'm not disobedient to God. I'm not all these things. I have a mental illness. And I already knew I had other OCD and all of that. And so it made perfect sense to me. Now, that is unusual for a person with scrupulosity. Most people who are faced with diagnosing with scrupulosity will be resistant to it because they're like, well, if I believe that, what if I'm deceived and allow myself to sin because I think it's a mental illness? But I was ready to receive that diagnosis. And so immediately I'm like, oh, I know what to do now. I know what to do when a blasphemous thought enters my head. I don't fight it. I just let it move on. I just recognize that's not my thought and go about my business. And and I knew, like with the scripture reading, no, you're not going to repeat it. No, if you yawn in the middle of the Lord's Prayer, you don't have to start it over and say it from the beginning. You can just finish it out. And or if you say it wrong, or if I don't do, I used to have to pray in a certain order,
I forget the acronym.
Acts. Adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication.
Yep.
I used to have to, I would throw out a prayer to God. Oh God, please help me. I'm like, oh wait, I haven't done adoration yet. I can't be asking for help if I haven't done adoration and confession. And so praying, I threw all of that out the window and said, I'm just going to pray. I'm not going to force myself into these. So I knew how to deal with it. And very quickly at that point was able to, of course, it had been years of counseling for all the other stuff, but the scrupulosity, very quickly I was able to bring it back under control. And like I say, I will probably have some of it for the rest of my life. I still struggle with some of it. And off and on, if I'm really stressed, it comes back a lot. But I know what to do with it now. And so I don't get caught back in the cycle of it. And it's been very freeing and very to realize I don't have to have certainty. I can, and I, in my book, I even mentioned, I even titled one of the chapters, The Idol of Certainty, because it becomes an absolute idol. I must have certainty. I demand I have certainty. Well, life isn't certain. Things that aren't certain. My relationship with God isn't certain in the fact that I can't lay it out on a table and inspect it and look at it and say, oh yeah, there it is right there. No, it's faith.
You go to the core of Christianity, the very fact that God gave us free will takes a lot of certainty out of everything.
Well, and I was raised that the opposite of faith is doubt. That if you have doubt, that you're not having faith. But the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is unfaith. It's choosing not to believe. You actually cannot have faith without the possibility of doubt. Because then there's nothing. You don't need faith. If it's certain, you don't need faith.
Yep.
And so getting that key there, that it's okay to have doubts. It's okay to struggle. That doesn't change my faith in God. And so it's been a wonderful journey, and I'm still on that journey, obviously, as I mentioned, the thing at church, at PalCon the other day, not able to enter the church. Every once in a while, my brain still glitches.
And you find
I find a way through it. Yeah.
So why did you write the book? What motivated you? How did you get past some of your social stuff? Because writing a book is very much putting you out there.
Yes, it is.
That's putting you front and center. Come read what I wrote, even if you're not intending it that way, even if it's just, here's a resource, I want to help people. Like, I'm sure that would be very tempting to be viewed as, look at me, look at me.
So I've wanted to write a book for a long time, for years and years, but part of my scrupulosity is this perfectionism. So I could never write anything down unless I wrote it down perfectly. So if I had to erase stuff or change it, then it wasn't good enough. And so I had to get over that. But what led me to write the book was, so all those years, 40 years essentially of suffering with scrupulosity, if just one of my pastors or counselors would have known about it, I think my life would have been very different, because I could have gotten the help that I needed specifically for the scrupulosity. So I wrote the book because I want others not to have to suffer like I suffered for so many years. I want others to find help and hope far earlier. I want pastors to have the resources that they need to help people like me and to protect themselves in those situations. And so it was just, this kept growing in me, this conviction that I want to share my story so that others don't suffer. And so several years ago, I had friends also that were telling me, you need to write a book. And I share in the book how my friend Carol, one day, she again said, Debbie, you really need to write a book. And I'm like, well, my problem is I can't write without a deadline. And she's like, okay, here's your first deadline. In 1 month, you need to have a table of contents. And she was serious. She was a retired university professor. So she knew how to do this. And so I took it upon myself, and every month she gave me a new deadline, and I wrote the book. And it was one of the most wonderful experiences I've ever had. And it just seemed to flow out of me what I needed to say and how I needed to say it. And it came together really quite quickly overall. But it was, part of it was laying aside the social anxiety part that says people are going to know things about me now. People are going to know my struggles. They're going to know I struggled and still struggle. And choosing to say, I can handle that if it will help somebody, if it will help other people. Because part of my story back years ago, when I was between my first and second year of college, when I had no hope, one day I hadn't been reading my Bible at all because I just couldn't. But one day I opened it, and I opened it to 2 Corinthians, the first chapter, where Paul talks about, if I have suffered, it's for your consolation. If the God of all comfort will comfort you. And it was like God gave me that promise way back then, that assurance that someday what I had gone through would help somebody else. And I don't mean that to say that God put me through this so that I could help. That's not it at all. I don't blame this was not God's will for my life. I don't believe at all that my suffering was God's will. It's a result of a lot of things, but I don't believe God wanted me to suffer. But my belief is he can take the most awful things that he didn't want even for our lives and turn them for good.
Yes.
That's the promise of Romans 8:28. It's not this, well, you're suffering so that you can help somebody. God's making you go through this, but it's God takes the awfulness and still can bring beauty out of it. And that's what he's done. That's what he's done with my story, is he has, I say God redeems. He's a redeeming God, and he takes awfulness and redeems it into something beautiful. It takes beauty. It takes ashes and makes beauty from ashes. And so I loved writing the book, and I love the reception of it, and I have been amazed. I was amazed at how I was able to do it, that I actually just barged through my fears and said, I'm not going to listen to you. When it came to getting people to endorse it, writing for people to endorse it, and figuring out how to get it published, I self-published, hybrid publishing, where I used a publishing company to help me put it together, but I controlled all aspects and all of that. And then contacting people for opportunities to do workshops and that kind of stuff. And that's
Where
all been.
Have you done those? Because I know you've done it like NNU. I know you've.
So as far as workshops, I did the Wesley Conference in 2020. That was my first thing. That was before I ever wrote the book. And that's what actually led to writing the book, was that conference, because I had to write it out for that. And then I've done PALCON, which is Pastors and Leaders Conference. I'm doing NAMI, which is National Alliance of Mental Illnesses. I'm doing their FaithNet conference next week here in Idaho. And I have been invited to speak in three different times at NNU in first year ministry classes to people who are preparing for the ministry. And I have done a number of podcasts as well. So, and none of those, had you asked me 10 years ago if any of that was possibility, I would have said absolutely not.
No way in this world.
No way in this world. I think my kids are stunned probably that I have done some of this, because the social anxiety was so severe. So, but yeah, it's been a journey.
So as you're still walking through it, you've written a book. I know you've changed churches a couple times in Idaho since you've been back. Have you just taken some of this? And you mentioned having to go to your pastors and ask for that assurance. So as you've gone through it, now that you know what scrupulosity is, how do you protect and safeguard about it? Are you telling your pastor, this is what I have,
Hmm.
here's some resources about it so that I don't overwhelm you? Or how are you processing through that with wherever you choose to be at now?
Well, the first few years after I was diagnosed, I became afraid to talk to my pastors because I was afraid, oh, it might be scrupulosity. So I stopped asking for help at all. And that was also not a good choice. Fortunately, I started with a spiritual director, and that really helped. And she knew about the scrupulosity and avoided the pitfalls that go with that. But since I've written my book, my pastors, I actually attend two different churches, and at the same, I go to one and then I go to the other, and not because I'm super spiritual or any. It's not a scrupulosity thing. It's just a life circumstance thing. And so my pastors at both churches have copies of the book, and I have talked with them about it and share openly. Um, and they know my story now. But I, I'm still working on the balance of when to ask for help in a healthy way and when not to. And so
Mm-hmm.
I tend to not ask for help when I should. And I did. I had talked to my pastor about what happened at Palcon because that was an area I just felt I needed an extra person to know so that I wasn't just swirling it around in my head. So I'm still learning that balance, but it's coming.
You mentioned one of the ways to support people with scrupulosity is walking alongside them compassionately, not in a
Hmm.
necessarily, I guess a way of putting it is in an enabling way,
Right.
but to walk compassionately. And I had I had a good friend once tell me the power of your story isn't in the story itself; it's in sharing your story.
Right.
And I think some of the same concepts apply to facing your fears or
Hmm.
anything. Once you can name it and face it, you're not hiding it. You're not
Hmm.
internalizing it. There's such a shame component to that.
Right.
If I can't share my story, I'm like this.
Yes.
But if I can open up and share it, people can walk alongside
Right.
compassionately. They can help.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that, you learn in trauma counseling is for people who have been through trauma, the way that they can overcome it is to tell their story. And sometimes it takes telling their story over and over and over. But as they do, every time they tell it, they are becoming freer and freer. More is being released. And it's the same with this. And did that's why I choose to share openly, is because I'm determined not to hide in the shame, because there's so much shame with scrupulosity. It is, you drown in shame, and to get it out and talk about it with people you trust and who love you, and and just have it out there is so freeing. It
Yeah.
takes the power out of it. Story, that's why this podcast is important, because storytelling is a powerful way of remaining free,
Yep.
of having freedom
That's the
and keeping
entire
that going.
reason I started this podcast. I believe there's power in story, in sharing it and viewing how other people have walked through their lives.
Hmm.
At the beginning, as you were talking about the different things that your different churches were telling you and competing, I was actually thinking in terms of narratives and story. One of the primary ways we operate in the world is through narrative.
Hmm.
One of the primary ways we learn, whether value systems, ethics, morals, is through story and narrative. I believe that's even why Jesus talked in parables instead
Hmm.
of here's an exact rule book. Is we learn by walking through what other people have seen, what they have experienced. We can try on that method of living
Right.
without actually doing it in the physical world. So when other people are going through things like scrupulosity and they feel completely alone, when they hear a story like yours and can see that
Hmm.
I'm not alone,
Right.
this isn't something shameful, there is hope on the other side.
Hmm.
That's the entire purpose of the podcast to me
Yeah.
is share those stories, share those
Yep.
journeys share that yes, life is a roller coaster at times.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to hit the lowest of lows, and you're going to hit some high points.
Mm-hmm.
But what can get you through all of that is seeing that you're not alone,
Yeah.
hearing some of those other stories, but then also it's I'm struggling to think of the phrase, but you don't have to make someone else's mistakes. You can learn from
Right.
someone else's
Right.
mistakes. So hearing some of these stories too, it's like, okay, maybe someone can get help with scrupulosity far earlier because
Mm-hmm.
a pastor or a therapist or a counselor knows what to look for.
Right. And that's my hope. That's my goal with writing the book and with talking openly about my story.
Well, with that, why don't you show off your book? And I hear a rumor you're thinking of writing another book.
I am thinking about writing another book. So this was my first one. It's been out for a couple of years now and it's doing really well. And I'm super excited. It's The Hijacked Conscience, an informed and compassionate response to religious scrupulosity. And the book that I am hoping to write, or I'm considering, I have about 3 books actually I would like to write. But the one that's really working around in my head right now is one about corporate worship as spiritual formation. So I grew up hearing, well, you don't worship well at church because you don't worship well at home in your private devotions, as they call it. And I think it's actually the opposite. I think we can learn so much from corporate worship that can inform our lives and help form us as individuals. And so I'd kind of like to write a book about that. I'm mulling it over still and thinking through it and gathering information, and maybe we'll see if that happens.
Maybe I should set a deadline for you.
Oh dear, what have I done?
All jokes aside, though, if people did want to find your book, where could they get it?
So it's available on Amazon. It's also available on Amazon Kindle. So for ebooks, it's also available as an audiobook from Amazon or from most Audible book platforms. It's available.
Nice. I know there's a little more there. I mentioned at the start of the episode one of the awards, but I know that you've been nominated or won several. And how many have you sold?
I have, at this point, I've sold 725 or so books, which is pretty good for a self-published author. It's not
Yeah.
the thousands that, you know, those that are known out in society sell, but I'm super pleased with that. That's actually considered very successful.
And it's in a targeted niche
Yes.
area. It's not
Yes.
just, in some ways, it's broad for everyone, but it's targeted in a specific area. So
Yeah.
I would say that's definitely successful.
And so that's been really exciting. Far more than I ever thought. Thought if I make 500, I am going to really celebrate. And so we went out for a fancy meal and celebrated when I sold 500. I'm like, that's probably it. But
What are you going to do when you
still
hit
going.
1,000?
I think I want to, I don't know, go on vacation.
I
But
can see that.
yeah.
Well, if anybody wanted to follow you, where would they find you?
So on Facebook is the only media platform that I have right now. It's under Debra Peck, author, and they can find me on there. And as you mentioned that the book has been nominated, it was Book Life's in my category. It was the finalist in my category for Book Life in 2023, and then the next year it was listed as one of Book Life's 2024 best books. It also got a 5-star read reviews, and a finalist in, I can't remember the name of the other one, but there's been 3 essentially where I've been at. I haven't won the grand prize, but the finalist prize, and one of those came with a social media advertising campaign, which was very nice not to have to do my own advertising for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I know we've talked a little bit about advertising. That's something everybody has to figure out to some degree.
And it's not something I relish.
Not my favorite thing either. But, well, thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
You learned some things about your mom you didn't know, maybe.
Maybe a few.
Although you've read the book. So.
And you've learned some about me.
That's
and
true.
Some interesting side stories that still paralleled yours.
Yep, that's very true.
But
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure, and we will sign off. Thanks for watching the Brenton Peck Podcast.